Humanity operates within a hierarchical structure containing 5 distinct tiers of influence. The overwhelming majority of individuals will remain confined within the initial stratum throughout their existence. These people expire anonymously, perpetually yielding to external direction, confusing mere existence with genuine fortitude. However, those rare individuals who ascend to the ultimate tier transform into something fundamentally different from ordinary mortals. They transcend traditional definitions of sovereignty and dominion. Instead, they become the invisible designers who construct the thrones upon which visible leaders sit. Within this system, those who subscribe to dark psychology decoded gain insight into the subtle frameworks that shape authority and perception. Their identities dissolve into obscurity, while their directives reverberate through generations. These figures operate as phantoms capable of redirecting entire civilizations without leaving traceable evidence of their involvement. This discourse does not serve as inspirational content designed to uplift spirits. Rather, it functions as a clinical instruction guide, methodical and uncompromising, commencing precisely where conventional existences typically conclude. The foundational tier consists of those completely devoid of influence. The fascinating paradox lies in their absolute ignorance of this condition. This represents the sophisticated genius embedded within societal architecture. Such individuals maintain the illusion that their perspectives originate from independent thought processes. They harbor the conviction that their decisions carry genuine weight and significance. They embrace the belief that the liberties they desperately clutch were distributed through principles of equity and justice, when reality reveals these permissions were calculated allowances. A person convinced of their autonomy will voluntarily regulate their own behavior and actions. They inhabit metaphorical restraints while simultaneously defending those who forged such constraints. These individuals navigate life through predetermined patterns and instinctive responses. They react rather than initiate. They absorb rather than create. They comply rather than challenge. Yet when confronted with fundamental questions regarding their purpose, their labor, their suffering, they cannot articulate authentic responses without echoing narratives constructed by others. Standard justifications emerge consistently across populations, stating obligations, accepting circumstances as inevitable, viewing hardship as simply the nature of reality itself. These utterances fail to qualify as genuine answers, but instead represent bondage camouflaged as conventional wisdom. Observe closely and you witness these masses populating urban centers, educational institutions, religious establishments, employment facilities, and entertainment venues. Despite their overwhelming numbers, careful examination reveals their fundamental interchangeability. They constitute the indistinct multitudes, the obscuring haze that provides concealment for those positioned higher within the hierarchy. Such individuals lacking influence are not characterized by absent capabilities or insufficient ambition. Their defining quality manifests as capitulation to external authority. They perpetually await explicit directions. They continuously seek validation from others. They experience profound anxiety when isolated in their cognitive processes because independent thinking threatens banishment from collective acceptance. Consequently, they maintain silence when conviction demands voice. They manufacture laughter matching surrounding responses. They signal agreement synchronizing with group consensus. They contort their integrity to ensure survival, never comprehending that such survival demands the sacrifice of their essential identity. What compounds this tragedy further involves their tendency to ridicule those possessing genuine influence. They hurl criticism from subordinate positions while characterizing such attacks as ethical behavior. They condemn aspiration as malevolence. They classify self-discipline as harmful methodology. They romanticize inadequacy because witnessing strength confronts them with their deliberate refusal to evolve. Therefore, they construct compensatory philosophical frameworks, spiritual doctrines that celebrate suffering, ideological systems that penalize advancement, political structures that incentivize dependency upon others. They masquerade their resignation as righteousness and ethical superiority. However, morality divorced from capability represents mere performance art, a disguise adopted by those paralyzed by the prospect of genuine confrontation. Study them carefully and discover their existences governed entirely by apprehension, anxiety regarding social rejection, trepidation toward calculated risks, terror of consequences and retribution. Yet the most debilitating fear transcends all others, specifically the dread of accepting accountability because acknowledging their latent agency would necessitate action. And decisive movement terrifies those who constructed entire lives around passive waiting. These masses harbor expectations that societal frameworks owe them compensation, believing justice operates as an inherent natural principle. Imagining someone positioned somewhere will eventually acknowledge and reward their endurance. Yet endurance fails to function as legitimate currency within power dynamics. Compliance does not equate to ethical standing, and wishful thinking cannot substitute strategic planning. The individual remaining anchored within this foundational level perpetually serves as an exploitable resource for others who recognize his utility. His energy, his temporal investment, his cognitive attention become commodities leased to whatever entity offers the highest compensation at any given moment. He transforms into a hollow receptacle, a beast of burden, physical matter inserted into mechanical systems of production. Once that corporeal form deteriorates beyond usefulness, replacement occurs without ceremonial acknowledgement. Historical records contain no mention of his contributions. No commemorative structures honor his sacrifices. His entrance into existence occurred quietly without fanfare. His exit transpired similarly without notice. The world continued its rotation entirely indifferent to his absence. At this critical juncture, genuine self-examination becomes necessary, not as passive consumption of content, but as confrontation with uncomfortable reality. Determine your precise position within this ascending structure. Resist the temptation toward self-deception about preferred fantasies. Exercise brutal honesty instead. Does your existence unfold primarily through reactive patterns? Do external voices dictate what holds significance and value? Do you endlessly scroll through digital platforms, nodding in agreement, following prescribed paths, waiting passively for improved circumstances, simply because accumulated suffering feels sufficient? Individuals stripped of agency do not experience their condition as traditional weakness, manifesting instead as emotional numbness and relentless fatigue. They confuse exhaustion with productive effort. They misidentify constant activity as meaningful progress. However, motion without corresponding power merely describes circular repetition, comparable to a horse perpetually circling a carousel platform. The pattern continues endlessly rotating without forward advancement. Recognizing yourself within this description carries no inherent disgrace, merely serves as crucial warning. Those who remain permanently stationed here fail not only to succeed within the competitive dynamics, but never achieve awareness that competition exists in the first place. They mistake mere survival for intelligence acquisition. They believe longevity automatically generates wisdom, yet consider carefully if prolonged existence thus far has yielded persistent feelings of incompleteness, chronic anxiety, fundamental replaceability, then question what foundation has actually been constructed through such efforts. Survival fundamentally differs from achievement. Endurance cannot substitute for purpose. Compliance represents no form of nobility or virtue. The moment arrives for awakening to reality. This foundational tier does not constitute imprisonment, but rather an invitation toward transformation. Beyond this threshold exist minds that enforce regulations, manipulate circumstances, issue commands, and ultimately vanish from visible record. Ascending requires first abandoning self-deception regarding current positioning. Genuine influence commences with absolute clarity of vision. Such clarity emerges exclusively through confronting painful truths. Understanding one's true position, however, introduces dangerous awareness. Once reality becomes visible, reverting to ignorance becomes impossible. The precise instant a person without agency recognizes their powerlessness creates a decisive crossroads demanding choice between continued numbness or genuine awakening. Selecting awakening propels entry into the secondary tier occupied by enforcers. This represents where most individuals initially experiencing influence arrive. They have not yet achieved liberation but no longer remain completely unconscious. They have acquired strength manifesting through physical prowess, financial resources, or social standing. However, recognize that strength lacking strategic vision constitutes merely sophisticated servitude dressed in impressive appearance. The enforcer fundamentally remains a servant executing orders handed down from above. He maintains systemic integrity and continuation. Advancement through hierarchical ranks may occur, yet sovereignty remains perpetually absent. Most tragically, he genuinely believes he has reached the summit of possible achievement. This role carries seductive appeal because it generates illusions of dominance and control. He adorns himself with identifying uniforms. He carries symbols of authority and legitimacy. He directs subordinates and manages operational personnel. He delivers commands expecting compliance. He receives deference and respect from those positioned below, yet deeper examination reveals his power remains borrowed rather than owned. He possesses permission to wield authority contingent upon continued obedience to structures positioned above his station. He embodies strength while remaining tethered, impressive in appearance yet fundamentally replaceable, and when directives shift direction, he follows obediently even when contradicting previously held convictions. This explains why countless soldiers, supervisors, officers, and operational managers experience quiet internal torment despite outward success. They receive dependence from others while lacking actual control. They command respect without experiencing freedom. They are trusted exclusively for execution, never for independent questioning, because the moment critical thinking emerges, they transform into potential threats requiring neutralization. Nevertheless, the enforcer remains systemically necessary. No organizational structure functions without his loyal participation. Higher position powers depend entirely upon his reliability, his behavioral predictability, his voluntary suppression of personal ambition in exchange for status recognition. He accepts this transactional arrangement willingly, trading independence for acknowledgement, sacrificing visionary capacity for structural security, obtaining authority while relinquishing authorship of his own narrative. This dynamic explains why numerous individuals construct existences around routines emphasizing dominance not for leadership purposes, but merely to experience sensations of power. They govern domestic environments through intimidation tactics. They issue sharp commands to subordinates with aggressive energy. They obsess over regulatory frameworks and punishment mechanisms. Yet all such behaviors function as elaborate masks, concealing the singular, unbearable truth they cannot acknowledge someone else authors their operational instructions. These figures populate every workplace environment imaginable, including the middle management personnel, policing colleagues with evident pride, the law enforcement official enforcing statutes he privately questions, the patriarch imitating disciplinary structures while secretly fearing his own obsolescence and irrelevance. The enforcer clings desperately to duty because it provides scripted existence. He fears silence because within quietude he might encounter his own suppressed doubts and uncertainties. He avoids reflection because introspection might illuminate how much sovereignty he exchanged for structural predictability. He guards access points without investigating who constructed barriers or understanding underlying motivations. He destroys others for regulatory compliance he never participated in creating. When higher authorities modify their agenda unexpectedly, the enforcer must smile graciously and comply regardless of personal degradation, because that represents the inherent cost of borrowed power. When authority originates externally, revocation remains perpetually possible. However, one unmistakable indicator signals the enforcer's readiness for evolution, specifically disillusionment. That bitter awakening moment when respect laboriously earned begins feeling fundamentally hollow and meaningless. When medals, promotions, public applause no longer silence the persistent question reverberating through consciousness, specifically questioning whether this represents the totality of possible achievement. This moment carries sacred significance because only individuals who have tasted power, yet lost reverence for it, possess capacity for ascending further. Only those who experienced control while recognizing their own controlled status will summon courage necessary for stepping outside prescribed boundaries. Departing from established lines represents the genesis of authentic freedom. Yet understand clearly the upward trajectory contains nothing heroic or celebrated. When the enforcer questions systemic foundations, he immediately transforms into a threat requiring containment. The same hands that previously applauded now point accusingly, labeling him disloyal, arrogant, dangerous to stability. Consequently, most enforcers remain permanently stationed, avoiding uncomfortable questions, silencing internal voices, protecting salaries, positions, rankings. Yet profound awareness persists beneath surface compliance. Understanding truth was exchanged for titles, recognizing transformation into powerful machinery simultaneously controlled, commanding yet replaceable, valuable yet ultimately disposable. The individual questioning orders without possessing independent alternatives steps into the most volatile realm, imaginable, specifically the third tier occupied by schemers. This represents the domain of deception and calculated facades. Here, raw obedience expires, completely replaced by something considerably more dangerous, specifically strategic self-interest pursued with methodical precision. The schemer refuses servitude, instead choosing manipulation as primary methodology. He studies people as though examining cartographic representations, He trades authenticity for competitive advantage at every opportunity. He listens far more than speaking, flatters rather than challenging directly, observes every movement not seeking meaning, but identifying leverage points for exploitation. Within this tier, power cannot be seized through direct force. Instead, it must be extracted silently through incremental accumulation, utilizing influence, persuasion, and deliberate design. Despite considerable cunning displayed, the schemer remains fundamentally exposed to detection because manipulation requires physical presence within relevant environments, remaining visible, maintaining apparent necessity. This level appropriately rewards intelligence while simultaneously punishing emotional attachment to outcomes or relationships. The schemer cannot afford authentic loyalty under any circumstances. Every alliance exists provisionally subject to immediate termination. Every smile undergoes careful calculation and measurement. Every conversation represents transactional exchange, performative display, rehearsal for future control scenarios. He flourishes within courtly settings, corporate hierarchies, political movements, essentially anywhere structured power exists, yet ultimate authority remains contested and insecure. He becomes the favored counselor to monarchs, the trusted advisor to chief executives, the confidential consultant to military commanders, yet never achieves sovereign status himself because his power fundamentally depends upon operating from shadows rather than direct illumination. He dreads revelation. He experiences terror regarding detection and being surpassed strategically. Confidence toward others remains perpetually absent because he perceives with excessive clarity how trust functions as exploitable vulnerability. Consequently, he descends into self-consuming patterns. He accumulates confidential information, treating it as financial assets, favors as armaments, connections as protective insurance policies. Yet internally, deterioration progresses relentlessly. An individual incapable of authentic expression, perpetually performing manufactured personas, gradually loses comprehension of his original identity before adopting protective facades. When this transformation completes, even triumphant outcomes generate hollow sensations. He prevails in debates, yet peace remains elusive. He acquires strategic partners lacking genuine dedication. He ascends hierarchical structures, never knowing whether foundations will be eliminated beneath him tomorrow. Nevertheless, such manipulators remain systemically indispensable. Organizational power frameworks depend entirely upon their presence, because they accomplish what enforcers cannot execute, specifically bending cognitive frameworks instead of physical bodies. They generate transformations within cultural landscapes, alliance structures, collective perspectives. They redirect populations without employing physical intervention. Their catastrophe manifests as follows: gaining substantial influence simultaneously costs all security. Their authority exists exclusively within tension dynamics. The instant they hesitate or pause action, they transform into expendable resources. The sovereign begins experiencing doubt regarding their utility. The masses begin cultivating resentment toward them. They become convenient sacrificial targets because everyone recognizes their intellectual capabilities, and intelligence-absent safeguards provokes widespread apprehension. Ultimately, most strategic manipulators expire with betrayal instruments embedded in their backs or damaging rumors attached to their identities. Historical memory preserves them not for intellectual contributions, but for suspicious behaviors and paranoid tendencies. Their natural talents become prosecutorial evidence deployed against them. Despite these outcomes, certain individuals genuinely cherish occupying this tier. They experience exhilaration from being required by those possessing superior authority. They derive satisfaction from navigating multiple competing factions, accumulating leverage obligations, dominating conversational dynamics, and temporarily they experience flourishing success. However, closer examination reveals the highest functioning manipulators are not genuinely pursuing power itself. They flee from insignificance and obsolescence because they have sampled proximity to extraordinary achievement, yet cannot tolerate the compensation required for stepping into illuminated visibility. They prefer maintaining essential status within concealment over achieving sovereignty within transparent reality. Sovereignty carries accountability consequences, public exposure, calculated risks, and most strategic manipulators, despite considerable cunning, fundamentally remain cowards. They would prefer influencing monarchs over becoming monarchs themselves because monarchs remain visible, and visibility transforms you into a target for elimination. However, if you currently listening identify as a manipulator or detect scheming tendencies emerging within yourself, a passageway still exists, though extraordinarily narrow. It demands sacrifice not of intellectual capacity, not of strategic methodology, but of your psychological addiction to operating invisibly. It requires departing from the competitive environment and questioning yourself, asking, what if I ceased shaping environments and commenced owning them completely? What if I abandoned advising sovereigns and transformed into one? Even if that meant experiencing hatred, being hunted, facing exposure. That represents the authentic cost of transformation. Only those prepared to relinquish their protective advantages, willing to risk being observed, blamed, challenged, ever successfully break through toward the subsequent level. The tier of observable authority manifests through crowns, thrones, roles that manipulators fear because concealment becomes impossible. Yet those who withstand its demands command more than whispered suggestions. They command entire civilizations. Crossing from manipulation into direct command resembles stepping into flames. The manipulator conceals himself behind influence. The sovereign stands isolated in complete view of the world. This constitutes the fourth tier, specifically the ruler position. No additional masks remain, no further whispers, no plausible deniability exists. The sovereign must articulate positions, must execute decisions, must accept responsibility for every consequence his voice generates. His authority no longer remains borrowed, suggested, or implied through indirection. It becomes proclaimed openly. That proclamation simultaneously marks him for adoration, jealousy, and destruction occurring simultaneously. Because wearing symbolic crowns means knives no longer hide. They approach displaying smiles. They arrive applauding enthusiastically. They disguise themselves as companions, counselors, romantic partners, and they anticipate the moment you display vulnerability. The sovereign possesses what the manipulator dreads, specifically visibility. However, he compensates by surrendering what the manipulator enjoys, specifically safety. Authority at this elevation is not constructed on leverage accumulation. It is constructed on presence itself. The sovereign becomes synonymous with the state, the enterprise, the movement. His identity becomes legislative. His appearance becomes symbolic representation. Yet with that comes crushing burden. A solitary, incorrect decision, a momentary flicker of uncertainty, a miscalculated prediction, and the masses revolt. Because populations do not love the individual, they love the concept of the individual. The moment he disappoints that idealized concept, he transforms into a villain. This explains why sovereigns exist with constant suspicion. Not because they suffer from instability, but because they perceive what others refuse, acknowledging specifically loyalty remains temporary. Admiration possesses superficial depth. The identical people who elevate you will celebrate as you collapse. Nevertheless, the sovereign must act decisively. He cannot delay, cannot conceal, cannot redirect responsibility. Every action he implements reshapes the order existing beneath him. That represents the gift of this tier, specifically the capability to construct. No longer scheming in darkness, now designing in broad daylight. A sovereign possessing vision can birth an entire era. A sovereign lacking vision can obliterate one. This explains why historical records preserve sovereigns, not advisors, not military commanders, not enforcers. It preserves the identity that authorized the proclamation, commanded the military, delivered the oration. The crown makes you immortal or infamous. The distinction between the two proves thinner than most can endure. Yet make no mistake, being a sovereign is not the final tier. It remains a role, it remains a position, and positions can be seized. The sovereign, though powerful, is exposed. He must perform, he must lead, he must justify, and every day he does, his adversaries sharpen their narratives. The ones waiting in shadows who never appear, never speak, never succeed. They observe. They study the sovereign's mistakes. They collect his failures like currency. Because they understand a truth the sovereign cannot afford saying aloud specifically, the visible throne is not the true seat of power. It is the lightning rod. Therefore, the sovereign must harden. He learns to smile while being betrayed. He learns to reward silence and punish unpredictability. He learns that kindness must be calculated or it will be used against him. And in this process, something dies. The part of him that once sought to be loved is buried not out of bitterness but necessity. Because power once achieved demands emotional detachment. The sovereign must be just but not naive. He must inspire but not depend. He must listen but never need agreement. And if he fails to master this paradox, he becomes a puppet a symbol moved by the hands of those he cannot name. Still, most individuals dream of this tier. They desire the glory, the admiration, the applause. They desire being observed, heard, crowned, but they possess no comprehension regarding its cost. They believe they envy the monarch until they witness how minimal peace he possesses, how every utterance is weighed, how every alliance is a calculation, how every display of strength is also an invitation to be tested. Therefore, most individuals fantasize about ruling but flinch at responsibility. They desire the benefits of sovereignty without the burden, and in that desire they reveal themselves as unfit. However, if you are already standing in this fire, if you know what commanding feels like and carrying the weight of those commands, if you feel the loneliness of the top seat and have not yet broken beneath it, then you are close, closer than most ever get. The final tier does not wear a crown. It does not sit on the throne. It does not make speeches or issue decrees. It is invisible, and it bends the sovereign, the manipulator, the enforcer, all of them from behind the curtain. That tier is not for those who seek praise. It is for those who seek permanence. The most influential individual in the environment is never in the environment. He does not elevate his voice, yet individuals commit violence in his identity. He does not appear in portraits, yet entire administrations bend to his preference. This is Tier 5, specifically the puppet master. He is not the monarch. He is the reason monarchs exist. His authority is not observed, only experienced. It lingers in decisions others believe they made freely. It ripples through legislation others believe they authored. His genius lies in disassociation, in the art of domination without ownership, authorship without signature, governance without exposure. He does not command. He engineers environments where populations choose what he has already determined. To comprehend this tier is to release ego. The puppet master does not care for applause. In fact, he fears it. Recognition constitutes a weakness. An identity can be targeted. A position can be stripped. But a myth, a force, a legend behind the curtain that is eternal. The puppet master survives because nobody can prove he exists. His fingerprints are everywhere, but his identity remains vapor. If you attempt to expose him, you are labeled paranoid. If you succeed, he already has a replacement. That is the brilliance of true authority. It does not cling to a single body. It flows. It reincarnates through systems, symbols, proxies like a virus with no cure, because it hides inside the host's own genetic material. He articulates through others, the executive who initiates a sudden acquisition, the legislator who reverses his platform overnight, the cultural figure who changes the conversation with a single message. These are not coincidences. These are designs, and most will never question it. They will debate the symptoms, never trace the source because the source is too quiet, too smooth, too embedded. The puppet master does not fight for authority. He arranges the board so others fight for him. He does not fear rebellion. He manufactures it when necessary to reset the system, to purge threats, to remind sovereigns that their grip is rented. He knows that all visible authority eventually breeds resentment. The crown becomes a target. The billionaire becomes the villain. The general becomes the tyrant. But what you cannot observe, you cannot attack. What you do not identify, you cannot overthrow. Therefore, he cloaks himself in foundations, in advisory boards, in offshore accounts, in cultural influence. He funds both sides. He supports rivals. He whispers to monarchs, then offers sanctuary to their adversaries. He plays long games, generational games, and while others chase quarterly wins and campaign cycles, he orchestrates centuries. However, comprehend this. Not every manipulator becomes a puppet master. Not every sovereign can disappear. To reach this tier requires one final death, specifically the death of identity. The puppet master has no face, no fixed allegiance, no ideology that binds him. He is adaptable because he does not belong. He is trusted by all but owned by none. That is why he endures, because loyalty at this tier is transactional. Relationships are expendable. Even self-image must be fluid. He cannot afford pride, only outcomes. This represents the highest, coldest, purest form of authority. To influence without needing credit, to dominate without needing acknowledgement, to disappear and still dictate outcomes. Most individuals cannot imagine this. Their ego needs recognition. Their pride demands acknowledgement. They desire thanks, praise, fear, and that is precisely why they remain vulnerable, because they leave trails. They seek approval. They crave the sensation of authority more than its results. However, the puppet master differs. He would prefer losing credit and keeping dominion. He would prefer being forgotten and still feared. He would prefer governing in silence than reigning in noise. That is what makes him untouchable. because nobody thinks to fight what they cannot observe. Nobody rallies against a whisper. If you followed this trajectory from the faceless masses to the loyal enforcer, to the cunning manipulator, to the isolated monarch, and now find yourself staring into this abyss of absolute detachment, ask yourself, are you willing to vanish to win? Are you willing to trade your identity for legacy, your appearance for force, your fame for permanence? Most are not. Most need visibility to believe they matter. However, those who withstand this final transformation become something else entirely. Not individuals, not sovereigns, but architects, phantoms, immortals. The ones who shape civilization while remaining invisible in its history. If you have reached this far, it is because something inside you already knows. You were never meant to remain powerless. Something within you has seen through the illusion and refuses to obey anymore.